Good morning and welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, I hope everybody had a wonderful weekend with their families. And I am looking at a mountain of notes, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into the show. But I guess I wanted to start the week off on a fun note. And I wanted to talk about an unremembered hero. I wanted to talk about a guy named John Hart. And you might be sitting there asking yourself, who is John Hart? Well, John Hart was a founding father of the United States. John Hart was born in 1713. And to be fair, John Hart's life was relatively unremarkable. His grandfather and his father lived in Connecticut. The family, John Hart's family, finally ended up settling in New Jersey. Now, John Hart lived a fairly unremarkable life, like I said. He was married. He had 13 children. John Hart was a farmer. Just a simple farmer. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't rich. He didn't have some lineage. He was just a simple man with a simple life on a farm in New Jersey. Well, John Hart was also very well respected because of that. And John Hart was elected to local office in New Jersey in 1750. Now, he was moved into politics, and John Hart, being a super nice guy, gradually rose in politics. Reluctantly in politics. He didn't want any part of this, but he did it as a social service. He wanted to give back. John Hart was such a nice person and so well thought of that his nickname was Honest John Hart. People just liked this man. They knew he was fair. Well, as the revolution rolled around, what happened? The state of New Jersey formed a Revolutionary Congress. Who was selected to that Revolutionary Congress? John Hart. John Hart was sent to the Second Continental Congress. John Hart at the Second Continental Congress voted on and signed the Declaration of Independence. So this man affixed his signature to the Declaration of Independence. Now, the interesting thing about John Hart is his age. If you look at most of the founding fathers, they were like anywhere from like 18 to 35 years old. They were younger men. Well, John Hart was a little bit different because John Hart was 65 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. All John Hart was a quiet, farmer, religious man, older man. But the one thing John Hart believed in, he deeply believed in freedom and liberty. And he couldn't offer his gun. He couldn't fight. But what he could offer was his life and his sacred honor. He wanted to offer his life and his sacred honor for a future he would not live in. He sacrificed his remaining years for a greater purpose. So here's 65-year-old John Hart who signs the Declaration of Independence. Well, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? It was 1776. What does he do after he does that? What does he do after he leaves the Continental Congress and goes home? He goes home. He returns home to New Jersey. Well, what's occurring in 1776? The British are attacking the U.S. states and colonies. So in 1776, right after John Hart gets home, the British invade New Jersey. What are they looking for? They're looking for rebels. They're looking for insurrectionists. That's John Hart. They're looking for leaders of the revolution. So, of course, the British end up going to John Hart's farm. Honest John Hart's farm, his property was raided and sacked. His farm was destroyed. His family was scattered, and John Hart was forced to flee. Where did Hart go? John Hart fled into the nearby Sourland Mountains. John Hart slept in caves. He lived in the woods. While he was living in a cave, one of his daughters died. One of his daughters died while he was living in a cave, and he couldn't go home to bury her because he would be killed. So here's this 65-year-old man living in caves. His life is destroyed. Well, John Hart reemerges in 1777, a year later. All he could do at that point was try to help with administrative tasks. He tried to help the fledgling government. Well, this whole thing took a toll on his health, and his health finally gave out by 1779. So Honest John Hart died 3 years after signing the Declaration of Independence. This man never saw the fruits of his sacrifice. But everybody listening to this everybody listening to the Foggy Dew, everybody walking around today, we all stand free because of a man like this. This guy gave his sacred honor. He gave what he could. His farm destroyed, family scattered, penniless, lived in a cave. And I guess my question is like thinking about a guy like John Hart, how in the hell have we forgotten this man? How has this sacrifice just been erased from history? This was a true blue American hero who stood on both feet for something greater than him. And I guess I was writing this thing about John Hart because he's always been one of my favorites. The only thing that I think is interesting is that nothing under the sun is new. I read a lot about Pericles, and if you don't know who Pericles is, I would check him out. But Pericles was a Greek general. He was a Greek general, a philosopher, a polymath. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. Pericles had a quote that I keep in my phone, and it's, quote, "Better die standing than live kneeling," end quote. John Hart knew that. John Hart knew it was better to die standing than to live kneeling, and he lived it every day. So I guess thank you, John Hart, for what you did and for your sacrifice. John Hart is a person we should talk about more, but it's just amazing to me, like thinking back on the sacrifice that these men gave and really what it means today. So thank you, John Hart. Okay, so I had a quick follow-up hit from last week. Last week I had talked about the Netherlands, and I talked about the Netherlands in a Zero Hedge article. Basically, what was happening is that the Netherlands were looking at taxing unrealized cap gains. Well, they actually did it. The House of Representatives in Netherlands voted on this the other day, and they passed this rule about unrealized tax cap gains. So what the Netherlands has now is a 36% tax on unrealized cap gains for the following: crypto, stocks, bonds, all of it. And the only thing I can tell you about this as a student of economics and history, they're in a death spiral now. And I guess really it's not a death spiral, it's actually a debt spiral. What they're doing is late stage economic implosion. Because the only thing I can tell you about this, it's like stimulus response of an amoeba. Based on this, all of the capital, all of the production is going to flee the Netherlands. I guess if they can. And what happens is when the capital flees, the tax base is gone. And I guess what happens at that point? It's going to be tax me harder, daddy. The people that are left are going to get stripped to the bone. Because I can promise you right now that the government either can't or won't cut social service programs. All they'll do is tax whoever is left even more. And all that'll do is accelerate the problem. Now they're on just a fast track downhill. And I guess the other thing they could do is cut social programs. But the only thing I know about that is that the natives are not going to like that one bit. And so if you zoom the scope back from this, this is the socialist communist wet dream, is to get into unrealized cap gains. This is their white whale. And I guarantee you all EU countries are looking at the text of this and they're salivating. But it's just so interesting to me because you know as well as I do, what's going to happen is all of these European countries that are having debt issues because of their social programs are going to move to this type of model and everybody's going to flee. And I guess like I was writing this and reading this, like, does this sound familiar to anybody? Like, California? California's doing it here in the States. I mean, I talked last week about how Zuckerberg is fleeing to a red state with a red governor. Capital flees when you have this kind of like onerous taxation. This is just theft. And I guess if you just play that string out, it's not just California. It's soon to be Virginia. It's New York. It's Illinois. I talked about it a minute ago. Again, nothing is new. This model has been tried before, and it didn't work out real well. But anyway, I just wanted to follow up on the story about the Netherlands because I just think it's crazy. It's just economically illiterate, but I'll be following it. Okay, so switching gears, I wanted to go ahead and address the SAVE Act. People had called me last week really, really worried about this. And the only thing I'm going to tell the Foggy Dew listener and the people that I talked with last week and texted, the SAVE Act is going to pass. It will, 100%. One way or the other, we will have voter ID laws moving forward in 2026 and beyond. But I wanted to address how I'm coming to that conclusion. because I think it's important given everything that's going on right now. I think we're watching a movie. All of this stuff that we're watching in the government just seems very, very scripted to me. And I guess let me explain that, because I want you to understand my opinion and my thought process on this. I have come to the conclusion that I don't think Donald Trump flubbed the rollout of the Epstein files, meaning that I think that this was purposeful. I think Pam Bondi didn't flub it. I don't think Patel flubbed it. I don't think Bongino flubbed it. And I guess what happened and why am I drawing that conclusion? I think that these people created this situation, meaning that they did this intentionally. And you might go, well, why would they do this intentionally? Because it looks kind of buffoonish. Well, my response to that would be like, what has everyone been talking about the last few weeks here? Jeffrey Epstein. And I guess I look at it this way. The administration knows exactly what they're doing. You cannot be fantastically brilliant in geopolitical affairs and then this dunderheaded in domestic politics. That doesn't make sense. It's incongruent. And I guess my thought on this is that normal people need to see Epstein. They need to see the depravity. They need to process it in their brains. I think people need to understand that Epstein and all the stuff that goes along with it is not a right or left issue. But my thought about this now with the administration is what they are doing with this whole process of Epstein. This has been in the news for what, months now? What is occurring is the administration, in my view, is stretching everybody's mind. They are stretching your brain to absorb more information. And I guess here, I wrote this down because I think it's a good way to think about it. Think of Epstein like the letter Z, and like you're looking at an alphabet. Assume somebody that thought all of this was a conspiracy theory was at A. So you've got A, and then Z is really, really far away from A, right? But if you're at point A and you're like, okay, I got to get people to Z, how would you do that? If I can make you, meaning if I, as the government or the Trump administration, if I can make you conceptualize Z, if I can make you process Z, which is the craziest thing, then it's going to be a lot easier for me to provide you B, C, D, etc. And I guess I think about it this way, like, so if Z is Epstein, then your B, C, D, etc. would be like Russiagate, COVID, 2020. If I've made you conceptualize Epstein, your brain is now much more able to process those things like 2020, Russiagate, COVID, etc. And look, I know that Balance of the Files dropped on Saturday, the Epstein files. And I guess just thinking about this whole situation, I don't want to have an Epstein show, right? Because I've been thinking about this stuff for a long, long time, but people are going to have a very, very hard time with this topic. Because I think what it does is it's like reality is fake. It's like you're conditioned to believe something, like about your government or history or whatever, that you're now finding out is just totally untrue. The careful scripted reality you have just flies apart and reality inverts itself. And I've talked about on the show, like I've known about Epstein for 20 years. I didn't really get into the weeds with Epstein until like 8 or 9 years ago, but I've had 8 or 9 years to process this information about Epstein, to process topics like New World Order, Epstein Island, Pizzagate, Seth Rich, Julian Assange, all the air quotes conspiracy theories that the mainstream media didn't want to talk about. And I guess just looking at it from a personal perspective then, over that 8 or 9 year period, my brain was stretched. So I'm looking around at like my fellow citizens, my friends, et cetera, that are just now coming out of like this coma. And it's very, very hard for people to process this. I mentioned it just a second ago. The careful reality that you lived in, that you were taught about, maybe is fake. And I guess that's one of the reasons that I started the Foggy Dew, because you have to find what is real. And I guess what is real? It's the stuff I talk about. It's the founding fathers, guys like John Hart, courage, heroics, Medal of Honor stories, God, religion. Those things are real. And I guess my point with that is that, or the conclusion that I came to at least, you cannot fake courage. You cannot fake running into a machine gun nest if you're Alvin York, if you're Eddie Rickenbacker. I mean, any of these guys that I talk about on the show. You cannot fake universal truths like courage and bravery. And I'll kind of wrap this up, part of it up, but like that's even the tagline of the show. Say a prayer, ask questions, stay vigilant. That's all you can do. But there are a lot of people out there processing a lot of new information, and it's really difficult for folks. But I guess circling back to my initial point is, I don't believe at this point that the administration flubbed the rollout. To me, it appears very, very deliberate that you would be discussing it. Like if you went to a restaurant on Friday night, you might be sitting around talking about Epstein. Having this rollout occur in this way where it's staggered, it looks like a mistake, it makes people talk about it. It lets this topic percolate in your mind. It lets it brew. And I guess my read on that is that normal people are being conditioned. Their brain is being stretched. So I guess circling back to my initial point, which was the SAVE Act to me just seems obvious. What I always watch when I watch media is the response. And that's exactly why I watch MSNBC, CNN. That's why I watch all this stuff. I want to see the response. Like, here's Chuck Schumer saying ID to vote is Jim Crow, that it's racist. That's just nonsense on its face. 82% of Americans, right and left, want photo ID to vote. And I guess the question that I would have you ask yourself is, why do Democrats oppose ID? It just seems very obvious that only citizens should vote in elections, right? But every single Democrat voted against it on record. 75% of Democrat voters want ID. So the Democrat Party in Washington is deliberately going against their own voters? You have 75% of Democrats that want this, and 0 Democrat politicians voted for it. And I guess like I look at individual responses. Look at a guy like John Fetterman, who is the Democrat out of Pennsylvania. John Fetterman goes out and he talks very common sense. He is on all the shows, the Sunday shows, etc. He's all over the media. John Fetterman is out there saying how photo ID to vote is common sense. But here's John Fetterman out saying this. Yes, this makes sense. Common sense. I'm a common sense guy. But he's going to vote against it. So when it actually matters, he's not for that. He's just putting on a show in front of the camera. It's a puppet show. And I guess I'll just go one step farther and look at the right side of the aisle to criticize the Republican. And please understand, I do not like the Republican Party. But look at the Republicans that are standing against this. Tom Tillis, Lisa Murkowski, Mitch McConnell. And I guess my point in that, like, what planet are we on here? The numbers get even worse on the Republican side of the aisle. 95% of Republicans want photo ID to vote. 95%. And here you have a person like Lisa Murkowski in Ruby Red State, Alaska. Donald Trump won Alaska by 14 points. So I guess my question is, what is this woman doing? She's sitting there she's defying her own electorate. It just doesn't pass the smell test. Look at a guy like Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell's from Kentucky, a totally red state. And please, I hear the conversation like in the media, like, well, their principles, they're voting their conscience. Don't give me this principles business anymore. Cocaine Mitch McConnell, cocaine China Mitch McConnell has no principles. His principles are whoever's paying him. So I guess broadly, my question is, what is the incentive structure here? And what is the incentive structure for Lisa Murkowski to stand in the wind like this? And I guess the only answer that you can come to is that they're compromised in some way. But then the question is, okay, if they're compromised, by who? By what interest are they compromised? You have 3 Republican senators that are defying 100 million red voters. that doesn't even process logically in my mind. And so I'm asking the question, like, are they compromised? And if they're compromised, by who? By what interest? Is it the same interest that Donald Trump threatens, that they want to kill him, they want to take him off the ballot? Is it a foreign power that is guiding them? Is it dark money? Is it the deep state? I mean, telling me it's racist or it's too hard, that's not going to work anymore. We asked for ID for cigarettes and alcohol. Is that racist? Their reply is, well, it's a constitutional right to vote. You don't need an ID for a constitutional right. Great. I love that conversation. If you are not a citizen of the United States of America, you don't have constitutional rights. U.S. citizens have constitutional rights. And I guess, newsflash to anybody using that argument, the Constitution is law. I mean, sitting around and telling me that a Panamanian national has constitutional rights, that's news to me. And I guess the question is broadly, like, how does a Panamanian national have constitutional rights? And if that's the case, that everybody, if you're breathing, like have a pulse on planet Earth, you get constitutional rights. I'm sure the Uyghurs in China will be happy to learn this. It's like, hey, Uyghurs, I know you're slaves in a Chinese concentration camp, but good news, you have a pulse and you're on the planet, so ergo you have constitutional rights. I mean, come on, man. Lay off the peyote. But I guess just looking at this entire situation with these people in our government, and this is just absolutely indefensible at this point. And that's right and left. It is on its face obvious that only citizens of a country should vote in the election. We're supposed to be the best country on the planet. Anyway, none of this stuff passes the smell test for me. So I'm going to be following all this stuff, but please don't worry about the SAVE Act. I'm very, very confident it's going to pass in one way or another. So switching gears, I wanted to talk big chessboard. And good news, the Monroe Doctrine is in full effect. And I guess the best place to start with that is Europe. Europe is totally backsliding here. The EU and its individual nations like England, France, Germany, obviously the Netherlands, these countries are all going down the tubes economically. They are socialist, headed to communist. And part of the long-term problem, and I've addressed it on the Foggy Dew before, is part of their long-term issue was the US being the EU security guard. We, meaning the United States, paid for their military defense through NATO. The cost savings that these countries had, they didn't have to invest in their militaries, so they had extra money. I call it a peace dividend. That peace dividend fed their stagnation. It fed their socialism. Part of this entire thing with the Monroe Doctrine and NATO is that we asked our EU partners to stand up and get a job. But I guess what I would tell you is that message has not been received. There is new news coming out about this whole issue. The Pentagon, the US Defense Department, they are all now signaling new things. The US is going to start downsizing in Europe. We're not only going to start downsizing our troops, but they are actively now talking about changing the US nuclear umbrella not to include Europe. The US is repeatedly warning these countries in Europe that US priority is our hemisphere. The Pentagon is very specifically telling Europe that the blank check is over. The credit card is being pulled. Now, the US ambassador to NATO is a guy named Matt Whitaker. And Matt Whitaker's quote about this is, quote, capabilities that may need to be ultimately transitioned out of Europe, end quote. He stressed that the US is, quote, not trying to dismantle NATO, end quote. And I guess my point with this, and this has been obvious for a while now, but Europe has to stand alone. We cannot keep doing this paradigm. And it's just becoming increasingly obvious with all the US moves across the globe. But again, Europe is just not getting the memo. And I look at it almost like a parent-child relationship. The US is acting like a parent here. And I guess you might be asking yourself, why was Matt Whitaker talking to NATO and not Rubio? Because that would really be the That would be the domain of a person like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. That is a massive change in our foreign policy. Well, Marco Rubio, and I'm sure you guys might have all seen this at this point, but Marco Rubio gave an absolutely killer speech in Munich on Friday. And if you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's 5 minutes of just brilliance. And Marco Rubio really talked a lot about things that I talk about on the Foggy Dew. Here's Marco Rubio in Munich. Quote, the euphoria, and by the way, I could talk about this whole thing for an entire episode. It was so brilliant, but here's a good quote from this. Quote, Marco Rubio, the euphoria of triumph in the Cold War led us to a dangerous delusion that we entered the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy, that we would now be living in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world. This was a foolish idea that ignored both human nature and the lessons of 5,000 years of recorded human history. I wanted to point this particular part out because I had talked about Francis Fukuyama on the January 19th show on the Foggy Dew. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, but that's what Marco Rubio is referencing. Francis Fukuyama is a liberal historian and political science guy that believed that history was over with because all governments would be changing to liberal democracies. But that was the book, The End of History. That was the roadmap for our State Department. And I guess my comment on that is that Foggy Dew listeners got the preview of Marco Rubio's speech. But the speech itself, Marco Rubio's speech, was one of the most eloquent speeches I've heard in the last 40 years of U.S. politics. And I guess I'll just back up to what I had mentioned just a minute ago about the SAVE Act. I see how this administration operates. They know exactly what they are doing. So to me, the outcome just seems obvious, like if you go back to like a SAVE Act. And I guess I thought about this too, like a Marco Rubio, like the intellectual separation between real and fake is becoming so stark. Real and fake. And it's not right left, but it almost is. People that are real, like when you look at stuff like listen to Marco Rubio, that is a real person. Donald Trump is real. Marco Rubio is real. Vance is real. Lee Zeldin, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK. But then you have the opposite side of the coin. Macron, Starmer, Newsom, Obama, Spamberger. Fake is losing the common sense argument now. Real is blowing past these people in an intellectual discourse, in common sense. But Marco Rubio is sitting here in front of Europe telling them the real. He's laying down the real. Good for Marco Rubio. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. But I guess no further, like look at Japan. Look at India. Japan and India are growing up. Those countries can defend themselves. And if you look at like a Europe is a dependent. It is a liability. Look at Australia. Look at Canada. Europe, Canada, Australia. These are not our allies. They were 60 years ago, and I really, really want them to be our allies. But they're just completely faltering. They're dependents. But it's almost like a kid with 10 warnings. Now they're going to get spanked. You had Europe cutting a deal with India, and then now they're looking at China. Europe is making bad deals from a weak position, and it's really sad to see. And all we're doing, this argument, I keep hearing this in like the mainstream media, like the liberal circles. We're not abandoning our allies. What we're doing is we're asking them to grow up. I just think it's so interesting looking at Europe because that will be our fate if we don't pull out of this tailspin. But I guess kind of on a similar point, I talk a lot about China. And I've talked a lot on the show about China being on the ropes. China is experiencing population decline. Their credit went ice cold. They've had a housing bust. Their U.S. exports are cratering. The height of their powers, they were at 21%. Now they're down to 7.5%. China is floundering. Well, I have good news for you. Russia is seeing this. Russia is seeing the chessboard. Now, before I get into any of this, I'm going to fully just say this out loud. Vladimir Putin is a thug, okay? The Russian people are actually nice people, okay? But Russia is somebody that we should be partner. I mean, we were partners with them after World War II. But this idea that Russia is like the boogeyman is not true. Now, were they right to invade Ukraine? Absolutely not. What they've done is absolutely horrific. But Russia's not going anywhere. You have to deal with them. And I think dealing with them on an economic basis is a good thing. But Russia now apparently is working on a deal. They're seeing the chessboard. They're seeing what Donald Trump is doing with the Monroe Doctrine. They're working on a deal, and if it comes through, that deal will kill BRICS. BRICS is like Iran, China, Russia. If this deal goes through, it's going to kill BRICS, and it's going to hurt China big time. I guess first off, I talked about Ukraine. Russia wants to end the Ukraine war. That obviously has to, all the killing needs to stop. This war is insane. It's gone on too long. But broadly, when the fighting concludes, this deal would do a few things. Number one, Russia would want to move back to US dollars. That alone would kill BRICS. Russia going back to the dollar changes the world overnight. But the framework of the deal is that Russia and the US are going to work together on oil and natural gas. What that would do is it would open up Russian markets for US imports, which would do what? That would help US domestic manufacturing. Russia and the US are already talking about working on nuclear power together. They would work on raw materials. So just a quick recap of the framework of this deal that they're working on right now. Obviously, the Ukraine war stops immediately. Russia goes back on the US dollar. Russia and the US work together on gas, oil, natural gas, raw materials. Russian consumers open. That's a massive deal. That deal would change the world and it would bring about a new era of peace. And the nice part about that deal with Russia is the ancillary effects of that, which is that China would be totally isolated. China is a bad actor on the world stage, a bad actor. This deal would kill BRICS. The US would reign supreme. US manufacturing, energy, dollars, the USD, those are all positives. It would also be huge for Russia. I mean, that's a big win for them too. They're brought back into a normal country into the world stage. But I guess I started talking about China. Look at China. They're losing all over the place. If they lose Russia, the only person they'd have left is Iran. Well, what's happening with Iran? The Ayatollah's on the ropes. The mullahs are on the ropes. And guess what else? The U.S. now has 2 aircraft strike carriers around Iran. The U.S. is moving big-time military assets on Iran. So what would I tell you about that? Iran is getting squeezed. China is getting isolated. China's hosed. But I guess if you're Russia looking at the chessboard, Russia's seeing the chessboard. They need to make a deal. And I guess just even looking at China even farther, I'll go one step farther on China. The U.S. just cut a deal with Taiwan last week. The Trump administration just lowered Taiwan tariffs to 15%. What Taiwan is doing for the U.S. is Taiwan is going to remove 99% of trade barriers to U.S. imports. The Taiwan government also agreed to buy $84 billion of U.S. goods. That $84 billion includes $44 billion in natural gas, $15.2 billion in aircraft and engines, $25 billion in power grid equipment, solid equipment like tech and energy military equipment. Well, that's another blow to China. If we have financial ties with Taiwan, China is less likely to invade it. And oh, by the way, guess what? This opens up another market for U.S. domestic manufacturing. But I talked about Taiwan and China. This development of stronger economic ties between Taiwan and the U.S., that is sending a message to China, which is don't mess with Taiwan. Taiwan is now a trading partner, an equitable trade partner. But man, you look at the scope of all this stuff, it's just deal after deal. Really unbelievable moves by the Trump administration on a global stage. And again, this is what I look about with domestic. You can't tell me these guys are this brilliant with foreign affairs and they're just wearing a dunce cap at home. I don't buy it. And I guess I'll leave the discussion this way when I think about like Taiwan and China and all this. I really never quite understood this whole China-Taiwan discussion with lawmakers. I guess the original sin with China, at least from a U.S. foreign policy standpoint, the scam here was that thinking China was a partner. In some way, the United States could depend on China. We've had presidents, other than Donald Trump, you have presidents, politicians. These guys are always talking about China invading Taiwan. So I would sit here and listen to listen to Joe Biden. I would listen to presidents. All these people talk about like China's going to invade Taiwan. Well, then they would sit there and go, okay, China's going to invade Taiwan, and then the US would somehow be assisting Taiwan militarily. Well, there's kind of a problem with that, which is that at the height of it, we were buying 21% of our goods from China. So basically a quarter of our economy is dependent upon China, and then we're going to attack them to help Taiwan? Like, how does that work? I don't really even understand it. So we're going to go ahead and attack China because they decide to invade Taiwan. And what are they going to keep shipping us? Critical medicine, supplies, raw materials? We just expect that. So if we attack China, they're going to continue shipping us stuff we need. I never even understood that whole argument. I think it's crazy. But I guess the only thing I can tell you about anything with what Donald Trump is doing is that breaking reliance on a hostile foreign power was very, very critical to long-term U.S. success and us being sovereign. But I guess conversely, it's absolutely clueless to talk about supporting Taiwan during a Chinese invasion when we're buying from China. Anyway, I just never understood that whole thing. But the moves the Trump administration is making on a world stage are absolutely brilliant. And look, I said it before about Russia. Go into that with one eye open. But if somehow we can end the killing in Ukraine and get an equitable deal going with Russia, great. I think they absolutely need to pay penalties for what they did in Ukraine, but that stabilizes the world order. People aren't killing each other. And let's be honest, it affects BRICS, and that's the main point. But I'll be watching all that very closely. So I had another quick hit for it. I'll kind of wrap the show up with this, but last week I had talked about the Donald Trump administration rolling back Obama-era science on greenhouse gases. That science, those laws were a straitjacket on U.S. manufacturing. Those laws slowed our growth. So I said, I'm going to watch the response from Obama. Well, here was Barack Obama on Twitter. Today, the Trump administration repealed the endangerment finding. That ruling served as the basis for limits on tailpipe emissions and power plant rules. Without it, we'll be less safe, less healthy, and less able to fight climate change. Also, the fossil fuel industry can make even more money. Unbelievable. Okay, and I wanted to also kind of go along with the mainstream media comment on this. So here's fake news ABC David Muir. This guy got on national TV and said this. Here's Muir, quote, President Trump has repealed U.S. power to regulate climate in this country. The president officially rejecting the science. This is not only dangerous for the environment, but for your health, end quote. Fake news by a propagandist. ABC News, safe and effective. Hunter Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation. Joe Biden is cognizant. 79 felonies. 60 lawsuits on 2020. Trust the science. I mean, I had to laugh looking at this David Muir on ABC News. I mean, Pravda is blushing. Joseph Goebbels is impressed. I mean, it's just so crazy to me. You got Alexander, Solzhenitsyn is rolling in his grave. I guess Orwell is too. But I guess it's very, very important to understand what happened here, because they're not just like climate science denying, but back the story up to 2009. So they talk about this environmental finding. So Obama's EPA in 2009 issued a finding. Scientists concluded that car emissions spewed greenhouse gases, that vehicle emissions cause air pollution. So what they did is okay, that science is now, we're going to create they're going to attach it to a law. So they took this evidentiary finding on these greenhouse gases, that engines were spewing greenhouse gases, and that finding was attached to Section 202 of the Clean Air Act. Their assertion with this whole thing is that car emissions endanger public health and welfare. So they attached this finding to a bill, which again is the Clean Air Act. That's the problem here. They attached a finding to a law. I don't know much about law, but if you want to amend a bill, it needs to be voted on. You can't just say, okay, here's a bill. I'm going to go ahead and just amend it how I see fit because I think the science says. If Barack Obama wanted that amended legally, send it to Congress. Congress passed the Clean Air Act. The administration has no legal authority to just add stuff onto a bill. You don't get to unitarily just change laws as you see fit. So here they go. They attach this finding to a law, illegally, by the way. So that finding on emissions was never challenged in court. But that finding that was attached to the Clean Air Act, that was the legal predicate for emissions requirements on cars, for vehicle regulations. Well, what did all those rules and regulations do? It raised the manufacturing cost of vehicles. So car manufacturers had to pay more to make these vehicles that were like emission friendly. Car manufacturers had to follow these insane rules. Well, what else did it do? It also led to this insanity about electric vehicles. This entire thing with the Clean Air Act was the predicate for Joe Biden, for people like Gavin Newsom. What this did, this finding attached to Section 202 of the Clean Air Act, this raised vehicle costs, and it affected consumers in every single sector. Gasoline, more expensive. Trucks, more expensive. When you're having all these kind of emission rules slapped on transport, the cost of goods is going to go up across the board. So this decision basically raised costs and prices on everyone. It's inflationary. So what happened with this? How did we get to this point today? Well, when Trump was elected in 2024, he issued an executive order. That executive order was 14154. That executive order forced the EPA commissioner to examine this finding. The EPA commissioner, just so you know, is Lee Zeldin. So Lee Zeldin isn't tasked with like denying science. What Lee Zeldin was tasked with was examining the legality of this finding that was attached to a bill. They're not arguing the conclusion of the finding. They're not arguing the science. What Lee Zeldin was asked to do is examine the legality of adding this finding to Section 202 of the Clean Air Act, because Obama did it by decree. Nothing is stopping Congress from voting on it. They could vote on it tomorrow. The problem with it is Obama couldn't get the votes to do this, so he decided to do an end around and add it, just tack it on, which of course was illegal. Barack Obama had no legal authority to amend a bill this way. Ergo, it was vacated by Lee Zeldin. So I guess big picture on this is that Obama acted illegally in 2009 when he did this. And let's be honest, Obama knows what he did here. He's not stupid. He's a constitutional scholar, right? He knows full well that you can't just tack stuff onto a bill like that. But I guess backing away from the thing about Obama, which just makes me mental, is that this finding, literally, this has gone on for 17 years. But that finding being tacked onto the Clean Air Act like that, this deliberately hurt U.S. citizens. These guys are talking about affordability. Nothing is going to be affordable when the base cost of everything is going to go up because of these ridiculous climate regulations that you put on U.S. manufacturing. This affected everything in our society. I talked about goods and vehicles, services, everything. And also, it materially helped China, my favorite. China was laughing at this. China is spewing greenhouse gases all over the place. When domestic manufacturers can't make a profit because of energy regulations, guess what? That business is offshored. So if you look at China's imports into the US, it was 7.5% in 2000. That's how China got up to 21% of US imports. And it was all because of this finding. And the thing that bothers me about this entire discussion is I think everybody wants a clean environment, right? Like I, as a citizen, want a clean environment for my children. But I guess my only point on this is that this is foolish leadership. And honestly, it's just dishonest. But the analogy that I thought about, like this whole thing, is like, because China's doing it. China's spewing greenhouse gases all over the place. They don't seem to care, but we're not allowed to. And I guess the analogy that I think about it is like, this is like having a trash can in your kitchen that's out in the open. You can see the trash, you can smell the trash. But it's like, okay, I don't want to do that. So it's like moving that trash can into the pantry. So you feel good because you can't see it anymore, but guess what? It still stinks. It didn't go anywhere. You just shifted it out of view. And then you just decide to deny reality. But I love Barack Obama talking like this. This cosplay is like Captain Planet is just so lame to me. Like the morally lecturing people on climate it makes me mental. And I guess if you look at it from that perspective, like the moral preening about this, like his climate morality stands in direct contrast to the real economic pain that this thing inflicted on U.S. citizens and U.S. manufacturing. And I guess my point is like, look, good science needs to be weighed by common sense. And we saw this in COVID. I mean, in COVID, we followed the science, right? Yeah, hey, great, we followed the science. All it cost us was what? $3 trillion in spending, largest learning loss ever for children, loneliness through the roof, depression through the roof, alcoholism, suicide, destroying society, harming kids. But boy, we really followed the science. There's got to be a balance between these two things, man. And I guess that's what really bothers me, but it's always like this moral play. You're a good person if you follow all our rules. And you're a bad person if you don't. And again, it's like illegal immigration. You're a bad person if you don't want the foreign horde swarming your border. And I guess, man, I don't want to rant about this too much, but it's just the gaslighting and the moral preening that gets to me. And I talked about the real and the fake. It's the Obamas, the Newsoms, the Macrons, the Starmers, the Kamalas, the Pritzkers. It's just this like two-dimensional managerial class. They're middle managers. But I guess thank you to the Trump administration. Thank you to Lee Zeldin. It just seems to me to be a big win for common sense. And honestly, this is going to be one of the biggest things. Again, look at the big picture chessboard. They're killing it on the global stage. This one thing with Section 202 of the Clean Air Act was stifling the U.S. economy. And I guess I'll make one last point while I'm thinking about it. It's always interesting to me because I always watch the media. You watch a guy like David Muir. David Muir's a guy that sits out there and talks about how Donald Trump is shredding the Constitution. It's always the opposite. Obama shredded the Constitution by not having this legally voted on. He illegally added a rule to a bill. And again, I love the response from the media. And let's be honest, from Democrat leadership, Trump is denying science. He's in bed with big oil. It's always anything other than the fact that like they added this bill on illegally, which again, watch the response. This is why I always watch the response. It gives the whole game away. Okay, look, hopefully you enjoyed the show today. If you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. As always, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew signing off.